The year is 1095. A pope stands on a wooden platform in an open field outside a French cathedral town, and what he says next will change the world. Not the world as it existed in that moment, a fragmented, feuding collection of kingdoms and states balanced precariously between faith and survival, but the world as it would exist for the next 1,000 years. The words spoken at Clermont that November afternoon would unleash an armed migration unlike anything Europe had ever attempted. They would send armies of knights, peasants, priests, women, and children trudging across 3,000 miles of hostile terrain toward a city most of them had never seen, driven by a conviction so absolute it rewired every instinct of self-preservation they possessed. What happened next was not simple. It was not purely heroic or purely monstrous, though it was emphatically both at different moments. It was a collision of civilizations occurring at a fault line that had been building pressure for 4 centuries, the trembling border between Christian Europe and the Islamic world, fought over in the flesh and blood language of swords, arrows, siege engines, and burning cities. The First Crusade produced some of the most dramatic moments in human history. A starving army discovering a holy lance beneath a church floor, and somehow finding the courage to march out against an enemy that outnumbered them. A knight climbing the walls of Jerusalem while arrows rained down around him. A city engulfed in violence so extraordinary that chroniclers struggle to find the language to describe it. But before any of that happened, there was a longer, quieter story, a story of centuries, that made all of it possible. To understand the First Crusade, you have to understand what the world looked like before it. Cast your eyes backward to the 7th century, to the Arabian Peninsula, where a religious revolution was taking shape that would permanently redraw the map of the known world. The faith that emerged from the revelations received by the Prophet Muhammad spread with astonishing speed through the mechanism of both belief and conquest. Within a century of Muhammad's death in 632, Arab armies had pushed deep into Persia, swept across North Africa, crossed the Strait of Gibraltar into Spain, and pressed up through France far enough that a Frankish army had to stop them at Poitiers in 732. Among the lands that fell to this expanding world was one that had been considered sacred by multiple faiths for centuries. Palestine, the ancient promised land of Hebrew scripture, the setting of the life of Jesus Christ, the site of the Prophet Muhammad's own miraculous night journey as described in Islamic tradition, was absorbed into the Islamic world when Arab forces took Jerusalem from Byzantine Christian control in 637. The Caliph Umar entered the city and, in a gesture that contemporary observers noted with admiration, refused to pray inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, citing his concern that his followers might later claim it as a mosque. This moment of relative tolerance set a tone. For the next 4 centuries, Jerusalem existed under Islamic rule as a city of remarkable, if sometimes tense, religious coexistence. Christian pilgrims were permitted, sometimes welcomed, sometimes taxed, sometimes harassed, but rarely outright prevented, from making the long journey to the sites of the Passion, Crucifixion, and Resurrection of Jesus. Jewish communities maintained a presence. The city's multi-layered sanctity was acknowledged by its rulers even as those rulers extracted political and economic advantage from it. The Byzantine Empire, centered on Constantinople, still controlled large swathes of the eastern Mediterranean and regarded itself as the rightful heir of both Rome and Christian civilization. Its relationship with the various Islamic powers that controlled the holy sites was complicated and perpetually shifting. Trade moved along routes that cut across religious boundaries, diplomatic marriages were negotiated, alliances of convenience were formed and dissolved. The great question of who held ultimate authority over the sacred geography of Palestine simmered without fully boiling over. Then came the Seljuk Turks. The Seljuks were a confederation of nomadic Turkish people from the Eurasian steppes who had converted to Sunni Islam and were pushing westward with tremendous military energy by the mid-11th century. They were not the cautious, administratively sophisticated rulers of the earlier Islamic caliphates. They were warriors who had absorbed the faith but brought to it an urgency and a military aggression that transformed the political landscape of the Middle East. In 1055, the Seljuk leader Tugril Beg entered Baghdad and effectively took control of the Abbasid Caliphate, leaving the caliph as a ceremonial figurehead, while real power passed into Seljuk hands. From Baghdad, the Seljuks looked westward and saw opportunity. The Byzantine Empire, which had once dominated the eastern Mediterranean basin, had been weakened by decades of political instability, palace coups, and military decline. Its Anatolian heartland, the large peninsula that forms modern Turkey, was rich agricultural land with significant urban centres, and the Byzantines had struggled to garrison it adequately against the probing raids of Turkish cavalry. The decisive moment came in the summer of 1071 at a place called Manzikert, near the shores of Lake Van in eastern Anatolia. The Byzantine Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes led a large army eastward, hoping to blunt the Seljuk advance once and for all. The Seljuk Sultan Alp Arslan met him with a force of considerably lighter, faster cavalry. What followed was a catastrophe of Byzantine military planning. Through a combination of treachery within the Byzantine ranks and the tactical brilliance of the Turkish cavalry's feigned retreats, drawing the Byzantine heavy infantry out of formation before wheeling back to envelop them, the Byzantine army was shattered. Emperor Romanos was captured. No Byzantine emperor had been taken prisoner on a battlefield in centuries. The news rippled through the Christian world with the force of a physical blow. Manzikert did not cause the loss of Anatolia overnight, but it accelerated it dramatically. In the political chaos that followed the battle, with rival claimants fighting over the Byzantine throne, Turkish war bands poured into Anatolia largely uncontested. Cities that had been Christian for 1,000 years fell to new rulers. Churches were converted to mosques or simply burned. Populations were displaced. By the 1090s, the Byzantine Empire had effectively lost control of most of the Anatolian peninsula, its breadbasket, its primary source of military manpower, and a crucial buffer zone that had historically kept hostile powers at a distance from Constantinople itself. The new Byzantine emperor, Alexios I Komnenos, who had seized power in 1081, was an intelligent and energetic ruler in an extremely difficult position. He had inherited an empire that was bleeding territory on multiple fronts, a treasury that was nearly empty, and a military machine that was broken. The mercenary forces he relied on were expensive and unreliable. His traditional recruitment base in Anatolia was now largely in Turkish hands. He needed soldiers, and not just any soldiers. He needed heavy cavalry, the armoured knights of Western Europe, who had proven their effectiveness against Turkish light horsemen in the occasional skirmishes that had taken place along the frontier. So Alexios did something that required him to swallow a significant amount of imperial pride. He sent ambassadors to the Pope. The relationship between Rome and Constantinople had its own complicated history. In 1054, in what became known as the Great Schism, the leaders of the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches had formally excommunicated each other in a dispute over doctrine and papal authority that had been building for generations. The two branches of Christianity were not at war exactly, but they were not particularly friendly either. For Alexios to ask the Pope for military assistance was to acknowledge a dependence that his imperial dignity did not relish, but he was a pragmatist. His request, delivered to Pope Urban II at the Council of Piacenza in March 1095, was framed primarily in terms of the suffering of Eastern Christians under Turkish rule. He needed mercenary reinforcements, skilled warriors who could help him push the Turks back out of Anatolia and stabilise his frontier. What he got was something considerably larger than he had asked for. Odo of Châtillon had not been born into wealth or power. He came from minor French nobility, took holy orders young, and through a combination of personal brilliance, administrative ability, and the kind of political acuity that navigates ecclesiastical hierarchies without appearing to, He had risen to become Archbishop of Reims, then a cardinal, and then, in 1088, the Bishop of Rome. He took the papal name Urban II. Urban was operating in a church that was itself deeply troubled. The investiture controversy, the long fight over whether secular rulers or the Pope had the authority to appoint bishops and abbots, had consumed the papacy for decades and left it politically weakened. His predecessor, Gregory VII, had died in exile. Urban himself had spent years unable to even enter Rome because a rival pope backed by the Holy Roman Emperor occupied the city. He understood power the way a man understands it. When he's nearly lost it, viscerally, completely, with respect for every lever and counterweight. By the time Alexios' ambassadors arrived with their request, Urban was in a stronger position than his predecessors had enjoyed, but the papacy still needed a consolidating moment, something that would unite the fractious churches of Western Europe behind Roman leadership, something that would demonstrate the moral authority of the papacy in terms that everyone, from kings to peasants, could understand. The message from Constantinople arrived not as a crisis but as an opportunity. Urban spent months considering how to respond. He travelled through France, still unable to safely enter Rome, meeting with nobles and clergy, testing the waters of what was possible. He met with Raymond of Saint-Gilles, the powerful Count of Toulouse, who became one of the first great lords to commit to the idea taking shape in Urban's mind. He spoke with bishops and abbots. He attended to the theological and practical architecture of something unprecedented, a church-sanctioned military campaign aimed at the recovery of the Holy Land. Then, in November 1095, Urban called a great council at Clermont, in the Auvergne region of France. Bishops and abbots arrived from across the Western Church. The proceedings dealt with various matters of church reform and discipline, but everyone present knew that something extraordinary was coming. Word had spread. By the time Urban rose to address the assembly, the crowd had grown beyond what any building could hold, and his speech was delivered in a field outside the city walls. No contemporary transcript of that speech survives. What we have are several accounts written afterward, by Fulcher of Chartres, Robert the Monk and others, each shaped by the author's own perspective and theological agenda. They agree on the essentials while differing significantly on the details, and historians have long debated exactly what Urban said. But the emotional architecture of the speech is clear enough from its effects. He described the suffering of Eastern Christians under Turkish rule. He painted a picture of the holy city of Jerusalem, the place where Christ had lived and died and risen, in the hands of people who did not recognize his divinity. He spoke of the violence visited upon pilgrims who tried to reach the sacred sites. He called upon the warriors of Europe to stop making war upon each other and instead direct their arms toward a holy purpose. And then he made an offer that the medieval mind found almost incomprehensibly generous. Those who undertook this journey with pure motives, Urban declared, would receive a plenary indulgence, full remission of the penance due for their sins. The theological distinction between the forgiveness of sin and the remission of punishment was subtler than popular understanding grasped, and the crowd that heard Urban that day almost certainly interpreted his words as a guarantee of salvation, a direct ticket to heaven for those who died in the service of this campaign. Whether Urban intended his words to be understood this way, and whether later popes deliberately cultivated this understanding, became one of the great debates of Crusade historiography. But what the crowd heard was this: God is offering you a way out of the burden of your sins. The response was immediate. Voices cried out from the assembled crowd, Deus lo volt, God wills it. Urban had not planned this particular phrase, or perhaps he had, but it became the rallying cry of everything that followed. God wills it. 3 words that would be shouted over the bodies of the fallen, whispered in the darkness before pitched battles, and carved into the stone of churches built to commemorate the enterprise. People began sewing crosses of cloth onto their garments, marking themselves as pilgrims and soldiers of Christ simultaneously. The word crusade itself, from the old French croix, meaning cross, would not come into common usage until later. Those who took part described themselves as pilgrims, as soldiers of Christ, as those who had taken the cross. The formal vocabulary of crusading developed gradually over the decades that followed this first great undertaking. Urban spent the next several months preaching the expedition, writing letters, sending out legates, and working to organise what he envisioned as a properly marshalled military force led by experienced nobles departing in the summer of 1096. He had not accounted for what happened next. Peter of Amiens was a charismatic wandering preacher, small in physical stature, his contemporaries remarked on this, but possessing a volcanic intensity that could hold crowds of thousands in the palm of his hand. He wore a rough woolen habit and rode a donkey, an image that those who heard him preach recognised as deliberate resonance with Christ's entry into Jerusalem. He had, he claimed, made a pilgrimage to the Holy Land and witnessed firsthand the suffering of Christians there. Whether all of his stories were strictly accurate is something historians have consistently doubted, but the emotional truth they carried was not in question. Peter had been preaching the Crusade before Urban called the Council at Clermont, and after it, he preached with renewed fervour. He moved through France, the Rhineland, and the German territories, drawing crowds of unprecedented size, and the people who answered his call were not the armoured knights that Urban had been organising. They were peasants, minor clergy, landless knights, freed serfs, women, children, the poor and desperate and dispossessed of European society. People who had no place in the formal military expedition Urban was planning, but who heard in Peter's words something that spoke directly to their circumstances. The theology of the indulgence had landed with particular force among people who had very little to lose and everything by the promise Urban had made to gain. For a serf whose entire existence was defined by grinding labour and the constant proximity of famine and disease, the idea that a great journey could clear the spiritual ledger entirely and guarantee a place in paradise was not just appealing. It was the most attractive proposition they had ever heard. Peter assembled a vast chaotic multitude and set off eastward in the spring of 1096, months ahead of the official departure date that Urban had set. This became known as the People's Crusade, or sometimes the Peasants' Crusade, though both names are somewhat misleading given that it included people of various stations. What it emphatically lacked was adequate supplies, military organisation, a clear command structure, or any realistic plan for how a largely unarmed mob would manage the journey to Jerusalem, let alone the conquest of it. The People's Crusade produced disasters before it even left Europe. As this enormous, hungry crowd moved through the Rhine Valley, violence broke out against the Jewish communities of the region. The motivations were a mixture of murderous theology. If one was going to fight the enemies of Christ far away, why spare those enemies of Christ who lived nearby? And straightforward predation, since Jewish moneylenders held debts that could conveniently be erased through violence. The massacres at Worms, Mainz, and other Rhineland cities in the spring of 1096 killed thousands of Jewish men, women and children. Some took their own lives rather than face forced conversion or death. Local bishops, to their credit, sometimes tried to protect Jewish communities by sheltering them within church precincts, but the mobs often broke through. These pogroms were not organised or sanctioned by Urban or the formal crusading leadership. They were the dark consequence of having unleashed religious passion on a massive scale in a population already saturated with anti-Jewish theology and economic resentment. The church would issue condemnations, and some of the perpetrators would face consequences. But the damage was done, and it established a pattern of violence against Jewish communities that would repeat itself with horrifying regularity throughout the crusading era. Peter's mob crossed the Danube and entered Byzantine territory, where their behaviour did not improve. They looted towns, fought with local populations, and proved entirely unmanageable by the Byzantine officials tasked with escorting them eastward. Emperor Alexios, watching this chaotic human wave rolling through his territory, must have experienced a moment of profound unease about what exactly he had set in motion with his appeal to the West. He got Peter's People's Crusade across the Bosphorus and into Anatolia as quickly as he could, which was probably a mistake since a better military commander might have counselled patience. But the Crusaders were restless and inclined toward violence regardless of direction, and Alexios was not sorry to see them move on. In Anatolia, reality arrived with the full force of the Seljuk military. A Turkish force under the command of Kilij Arslan, the Seljuk Sultan of Rum, whose capital was at Nicaea, fell upon the main body of the People's Crusade at Sivto in October 1096 and essentially destroyed it. Thousands were killed, others were captured and enslaved. Peter of Amiens was not present at the massacre. He had gone back to Constantinople on some errand. and he survived to join the later formal crusade. But the People's Crusade as an independent enterprise was finished. Its bones left to bleach on the Anatolian plain, a monument to faith untempered by any practical consideration whatsoever. The formal crusade was meanwhile assembling. Urban had designated August 15th, 1096, the Feast of the Assumption of the Virgin, as the departure date, and he appointed a papal legate named Adhemar of Le Puy to serve as spiritual leader of the expedition. Adhemar was a bishop of considerable personal courage and political acuity, and his appointment was shrewd, giving the enterprise clerical authority while leaving the military command in the hands of the secular nobles who knew how to fight. And what nobles they were! Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lower Lorraine, was in many ways the prototype of the crusading knight, as the medieval imagination would later construct it. Tall, fair, devout, and fiercely capable in battle. He was also deeply in debt from the preparations, having mortgaged and sold lands to fund his contingent's equipment and supplies. He travelled with his brothers, Baldwin and Eustace, Baldwin being a man of a very different temperament, more politically calculating and personally ruthless, who would prove enormously consequential later in the story. Raymond of Saint-Gilles, Count of Toulouse and Marquis of Provence, was the wealthiest, and in some respects the most powerful of the crusading lords. He was in his 50s, which made him something of an elder statesman among the leadership, and he had the blunt, stubborn certainty of a man who has spent decades accumulating power and getting his way. He had a complicated relationship with the papal legate, and an even more complicated relationship with several of his fellow commanders, and the tensions he generated would colour the entire enterprise. Bohemond of Taranto was the son of Robert Guiscard, the great Norman adventurer who had carved out a kingdom in southern Italy and Sicily. Bohemond had been raised in a tradition of aggressive military opportunism, and he brought to the crusade a mind of exceptional strategic sharpness, combined with personal ambitions that never quite aligned with the enterprise's stated religious objectives. He was enormously tall. Contemporaries remarked on this with something approaching awe, with a physical presence that commanded rooms and battlefields equally. His nephew Tancred accompanied him, young and idealistic in ways that Bohemond himself had perhaps never been. Hugh of Vermandois, brother of King Philip I of France, brought the prestige of French royal connection, but proved less militarily significant than the others. Robert of Normandy, son of William the Conqueror, led the Norman contingent from France. Robert of Flanders commanded another substantial force. These armies did not depart together. Each contingent set out more or less independently, taking different routes across Europe toward Constantinople, where they had agreed to assemble. They travelled through Germany, through Italy, through Hungary and the Balkans, arriving in Constantinople at different times between late 1096 and the spring of 1097. Alexios watched them come with an expression that must have combined relief at their military capability with deep apprehension about their intentions. These were not the polite mercenaries he had imagined when he sent his request to Urban. These were proud, well-armed nobles who regarded themselves as embarked on God's own business and who had no particular reason to subordinate their will to that of a Greek emperor whose church had been in formal schism from their own for 40 years. Alexios handled this challenge with considerable diplomatic skill. He had gifts brought to the arriving commanders, horses, silks, gold, which was both genuine generosity and calculated flattery. He cultivated personal relationships with individual leaders, meeting with them privately, showing curiosity about their lands and customs. And he pushed, gently but persistently, with both persuasion and the implied threat of cutting off supplies, for something that the crusading leaders were reluctant to give: an oath. The oath Alexios wanted was straightforward in principle and contentious in practice. He asked each major leader to swear that any lands recovered from the Turks that had previously belonged to the Byzantine Empire would be returned to Byzantine sovereignty. From Alexios's perspective, this was entirely reasonable. The crusade existed partly because of his request, and he was providing logistical support, guides, supplies, and military intelligence. The lands in question were, by historical right, his. From the crusading lord's perspective, the The oath created obligations they were not sure they wanted to keep, and that might conflict with their own ambitions. Several of them swore it with visible reluctance. Bohemond, interestingly, appears to have embraced it with suspicious enthusiasm, which probably meant he thought he could navigate around it later. Godfrey of Bouillon was the most resistant. He arrived outside Constantinople in December 1096 and spent several weeks essentially playing a cat-and-mouse game with Alexios, refusing to enter the city and occasionally allowing his troops to raid the surrounding countryside. Eventually, a combination of diplomatic pressure and the cutting off of supplies brought him to terms, and he crossed to meet the emperor in person and swear the required oath. By the spring of 1097, the army was largely assembled on the Asian side of the Bosphorus, and the campaign could begin. The force was substantial. Estimating medieval armies is notoriously difficult. Contemporary accounts were generally wildly unreliable about numbers, and modern historians have spent enormous energy trying to triangulate reasonable figures from indirect evidence. The scholarly consensus places the total crusading force at something between 50 and 80,000 people, of whom perhaps 15,000 were actual fighting men, with the rest being servants, camp followers, pilgrims, clergy, and others who accompanied the army for various reasons. This was not the largest army medieval Europe had ever fielded, but it was certainly one of the most ambitious in terms of the distance it proposed to travel and the objective it proposed to achieve. The first major obstacle was Nicaea. Nicaea was the capital of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, the Turkish kingdom that controlled most of Anatolia. Kilij Arslan had established his seat there, and the city was well fortified with ancient walls that had been maintained and reinforced over centuries. The Crusaders arrived before Nicaea in May 1097, and the siege began. Kilij Arslan had initially been somewhat dismissive of the Christian forces. He had, after all, destroyed the People's Crusade with relative ease the previous autumn, and he may not have fully grasped the difference in military quality between Peter's mob and the armoured knights now camped outside his capital. He was away fighting another Turkish ruler when the Crusaders arrived, and when he returned and attempted to relieve the city, he encountered a very different kind of enemy. The battle outside Nicaea on May 21st was the Crusaders' first significant engagement with Seljuk military tactics. The Turkish cavalry attacked with the mobile, arrow-shooting style that had proven devastating against Byzantine heavy infantry. Advance, shower the enemy with arrows, fall back before the heavier force could close to melee range, draw the enemy out of formation, then attack from the flanks. Against peasant mobs, this was nearly irresistible. Against the armoured knights of France and Normandy and the Norman south, it was a different matter. The knights' heavy mail and their discipline in holding formation allowed them to absorb the arrow storm, and when the Turks came close enough, the weight of the Western cavalry charge was formidable. Kilij Arslan's relief force was beaten back with significant losses. Nicaea itself, however, posed a problem. The Crusaders could invest it on the land side, but the western shore of the city, the side that faced Lake Ascanius, was open to resupply and reinforcement by water, and the Crusaders had no fleet. They sent word to Alexios, who dispatched a Byzantine naval squadron to complete the blockade. The city's defenders, finding themselves surrounded and having observed what happened to Kilij Arslan's relief force, negotiated a surrender, but they surrendered to the Byzantine officers, not to the Crusaders, and Alexios took formal possession of the city while keeping the Crusaders outside the walls. This was diplomatically sensible from Alexios's perspective. He had no desire to see his newly recovered city sacked by Western troops, but it created the first significant friction between the Crusaders and their nominal ally. The rank and file of the crusading army had expected to sack Nicaea and did not receive so much as a glimpse inside the walls. Alexios compensated the leaders with gifts and assurances, but resentment lingered. The army set off southeast, cutting across the Anatolian plateau toward the distant mountains of Syria. The Anatolian plateau was not an inviting landscape. Its interior was hot and dry in summer, cold in winter, and the roads that crossed it were primitive tracks rather than engineered thoroughfares. The army moved in two divisions, the better to forage. The perpetual challenge of a force this size was feeding itself. a problem that became steadily more acute as the campaign extended. The division that travelled separately from the main body included Bohemont's contingent, and it was this force that Kilij Arslan struck at Dorylaeum on July 1st. The Battle of Dorylaeum was the campaign's first great test, and it came within a few hours of being a catastrophe. Kilij Arslan had rallied his forces and gathered allies after Nicaea, and he struck Bohemont's column with his full strength, while the other division was still some hours' march away. Bohemond found himself surrounded by thousands of Turkish cavalry, his men fighting for survival against an enemy they could not catch, and whose arrows were finding the gaps in their armour and killing their horses. He ordered his infantry to form a defensive perimeter, told his knights not to charge but to hold the line, and sent desperately urgent riders galloping to the other division. The messages that came back were promises that help was coming. Hours passed. Casualties mounted. The Turks kept circling, kept shooting, kept feinting and withdrawing. The Crusaders held, barely. Then the second division arrived. Godfrey of Bouillon led the relief force in a cavalry charge directly into the Turkish flank. Raymond of Saint-Gilles attacked from another direction. The psychological effect was immediate. Kilij Arslan's forces, which had been pressing a fragmented enemy, suddenly found themselves attacked from unexpected directions by fresh troops. The Turkish army broke and fled, abandoning their camp, their supplies, their treasury, and much of their equipment. The Crusaders had won a victory that could easily have been a massacre, and they knew it. Dorylaeum was significant for several reasons. It demonstrated that while Turkish cavalry tactics were formidable, they had a vulnerability. When the enemy held formation and was patient enough to wait for reserves, the Turkish advantage in mobility became less decisive. It also destroyed Kilij Arslan's ability to field a coherent force in Anatolia for the rest of the crusade. The road south and east was now open. What the Crusaders found on that road was a landscape in varying states of devastation. Turkish raids had depopulated many villages, disrupted agriculture, and left a patchwork of areas where local Christian populations, Greek, Armenian and Syrian, had survived under Turkish rule with varying degrees of difficulty. These local Christians generally welcomed the Crusaders, which provided some local support and intelligence. They also provided a constant reminder of what was at stake theologically. Here were fellow Christians who had been living under Muslim rule, sometimes relatively peacefully, sometimes with significant hardship. The march south was brutal. The Anatolian summer of 1097 was intensely hot, and the army suffered terribly from thirst, heat, and the difficulty of keeping enough food and water moving forward to supply tens of thousands of people and thousands of horses. Horses died in significant numbers, forcing knights to ride oxen or simply march on foot, a humiliation for the warrior aristocracy that also degraded their military effectiveness. Pack animals died, reducing the army's logistical capacity exactly when it was most needed. People died too. The anonymous chronicle known as the Gesta Francorum notes the deaths of crusaders from thirst and hunger with a matter-of-factness that reflects the brutal arithmetic of the march. A significant fraction of the original army was simply worn away by the physical demands of crossing Anatolia, even without counting those killed in battle. The army reached Heraclea, then pushed on toward the Cilician Gates, the dramatic mountain pass through the Taurus range that controlled the main route from Anatolia into Syria. Here the story briefly diverges, because Baldwin of Boulogne made a decision that altered the course of not just the Crusade but the entire subsequent history of the region. Baldwin was Godfrey's younger brother, and he was in some ways the Crusade's most purely ambitious personality. He had a calculating intelligence that distinguished him clearly from the idealistic or pious motivations that animated some of his colleagues. When a Cilician Armenian ruler named Thoros of Edessa sent word inviting the Crusaders to help him against Turkish pressure, Baldwin saw opportunity rather than simply duty. With a small force, perhaps a few hundred cavalry, Baldwin detached himself from the main army and headed northeast into the Armenian-populated territory of the upper Euphrates Valley. The city of Edessa was one of the great cities of late antiquity, rich, ancient, and sitting at a strategic crossroads that made it enormously valuable. Thoros was its Armenian Christian ruler, in a complex and precarious relationship with the Turkish powers that surrounded him. Baldwin arrived in Edessa in February 1098. Thoros, with a mixture of genuine gratitude and political calculation, adopted Baldwin in a ceremony that, according to contemporary accounts, involved the Armenian ruler drawing the Norman knight under his garment and pressing him to his bare chest in a traditional gesture of adoption. The crowd cheered. Baldwin was effectively being designated as heir. Thoros did not live long enough to make good on that designation in the natural way. Shortly afterward, a popular uprising, possibly encouraged, possibly even organised by Baldwin's own agents, though the evidence is circumstantial, resulted in Thoros being killed. Baldwin found himself, almost as though by accident, the ruler of Edessa. The county of Edessa thus became the First Crusader State, established not through conquest from Muslims, but through the absorption of an existing Christian principality by a Norman adventurer with exceptional nerve and no particular scruple. It would prove strategically vital for the rest of the Crusade and for decades afterward, serving as an eastern bulwark for the states that would follow. But its origins were not particularly glorious, and the story of Thoros's death, whatever the exact circumstances, clung to Baldwin's reputation with some persistence. Meanwhile, the main army had crossed the Taurus Mountains and descended into Syria, and ahead of them lay Antioch. Antioch was not merely a city, it was, by the standards of the 11th century, a metropolitan statement, one of the great cities of the ancient Mediterranean world, the city where, according to the Acts of the Apostles, the followers of Jesus were first called Christians. It had been one of the Roman Empire's 4 great capitals. Its walls were extraordinary. Built by Justinian's engineers in the 6th century, they climbed up the steep slopes of Mount Silpius behind the city and extended for miles, enclosing an area so large that even a city of Antioch's size could not fill it. At the highest point of these walls stood the citadel, perched on a ridge that dominated both the city below and the plain to the west. The Seljuks had held Antioch since 1085, when they had taken it from the Byzantines under somewhat murky circumstances. Its current governor was a man named Yagi Siyan, an experienced military commander and administrator who had been appointed by the Seljuk Sultan. When he received word that a crusading army was approaching from the north, he faced an immediate dilemma. The city was too important to abandon, but too large to defend with the garrison he had. He sent urgent messages to neighbouring Turkish rulers asking for relief forces, expelled the Christian population from the city, a brutal decision designed to eliminate a potential fifth column, and settled in to wait. The Crusaders arrived before Antioch on October 20th, 1097. What they found dismayed them. The walls were simply too extensive to blockade completely with the force they had. The army spread out to cover as much of the perimeter as it could, but gaps remained. The mountainous terrain behind the city was too steep and broken to garrison effectively, and Yagi Siyan was able to move supplies and messengers in and out of the city through these gaps for months. The Crusaders established camps on the main approach roads and settled in for what would become one of the longest and most grinding sieges in medieval history. The Siege of Antioch consumed 8 months. 8 months of hunger, disease, cold, heat, desperate combat, failed assaults, and the constant psychological pressure of waiting. The army that had struggled across Anatolia now struggled to feed itself in a land that had been extensively stripped by Turkish foraging. Foraging parties went out and came back. With diminishing returns, horses continued to die. Disease, dysentery, fever, and the complications of malnutrition carried off increasing numbers of crusaders, including some of the less prominent leaders. The situation grew genuinely desperate as winter arrived. The Gesta Francorum records people eating horsemeat, which in normal times would have been considered deeply shameful for the warrior aristocracy. As the horses ran out, people ate donkeys, camels, dogs, whatever could be found. The poor suffered worst. Anna Komnena, the Byzantine princess who wrote a remarkable history of her father's reign, describes the emaciation of the Crusaders during this period with something approaching pity. even from her perspective of considerable skepticism about their enterprise. Deserters appeared. Some individual crusaders and even some knights simply gave up and left, fled back toward Constantinople, toward home, abandoning an enterprise that seemed increasingly likely to end in mass starvation in a Syrian valley. One of the most prominent deserters was Peter the Hermit himself, who apparently lost his nerve during the depths of the siege and tried to slip away at night. He was caught by Tancred and brought back, shamed but alive. The psychological pressure was enormous, and it produced a spiritual crisis among a force that was held together more by religious conviction than by anything else. Priests walked among the camps reminding the Crusaders of the indulgence they had been promised, urging confession and penance, arguing that the hardships were a purification rather than a punishment. Adhemar of Le Puy, the papal legate, was tireless in this work, organising prayer, maintaining discipline among the clergy, ministering to the sick and dying with what appears to have been genuine pastoral care. Turkish relief forces were a constant concern. 2 significant attempts were made to relieve the city, one in December 1097 and one in February 1098, and both were beaten back, though not without severe fighting. The December battle, fought on the banks of the Oronte River, was a grinding struggle in which the Crusaders' supply of arrows ran critically low and the fighting descended into brutal hand-to-hand combat before the Turkish force finally withdrew. The February engagement saw Raymond of Saint-Gilles lead a force that successfully ambushed a Turkish relief column, capturing supplies and mules that provided some temporary relief to the starving camp. Meanwhile, inside Antioch, Yagi Sian was watching his own resources dwindle and wondering whether the relief forces he had requested would arrive before the city fell. His messages to neighbouring rulers, to Ridwan of Aleppo, to Dukak of Damascus, to the Atabeg Kaboga of Mosul, conveyed increasing urgency. Kaboga was assembling a massive army, but it would take time. The key to Antioch arrived not through military force but through treachery. Bohemond had been quietly cultivating a contact inside Antioch. The man's identity has been debated by historians. He appears in the sources under different names and his exact position within the city's garrison is unclear, but his motivation seems to have been a combination of grievance against Yagi Sian and the promise of substantial reward. He was apparently a tower commander, responsible for a section of the wall. Bohemond brought this intelligence to the Crusading Council with characteristic calculation. He would reveal the means to take the city, he said, on one condition, that when Antioch fell, it would be his, not returned to Byzantine control as the oath to Alexios might have required, but granted to Bohemond as his own principality. The other leaders were not uniformly enthusiastic about this proposition. Raymond of Saint-Gilles was particularly resistant, feeling that the oath to Alexios was binding, and that Bohemond was using the crisis to advance his own ambitions. But the alternative, continuing the siege indefinitely while disease and starvation consumed the army, was worse. Bohemond got his deal, with the qualification that if a Byzantine army arrived to assist, Alexios's claim would need to be reconsidered. On the night of June 2nd to 3rd, 1098, Bohemond put his plan into action. A small group of crusaders climbed the wall at the tower controlled by his contact. They killed the sentries, opened the gates, and the army poured in. The fall of Antioch was followed by massacre. The Crusaders had suffered 8 months of hardship, and the pent-up fury of that suffering was unleashed on the city's defenders, and with less discrimination, on its population. Yagi Sian himself fled but was captured and killed before he could reach safety. The killing continued through the night and into the following day. The Cathedral of Antioch, one of the oldest Christian churches in the world, was seized from the Muslim worship that had occupied it for 13 years and reconsecrated. A patriarch was installed. The relief of having taken the city was almost immediately overtaken by new terror. Kabaga's army, the great relief force that had been slow to gather, now arrived, and it was enormous. Estimates vary, but it was certainly larger than the crusading force, and the Crusaders were inside the city they had just taken, exhausted and undersupplied. Now they were the besieged, and Kaboga held the surrounding high ground. The citadel on Mount Silpius, which had never fallen to the Crusaders during their siege, remained in Turkish hands, providing a hostile garrison literally above the city. Kerboga's forces surrounded the walls below. The Crusaders were trapped. The psychological extremity of the moment produced one of the most dramatic episodes of the entire crusade. On the night of June 10th, a Provençal peasant named Peter Bartholomew came to the Count of Toulouse and the papal legate with an extraordinary story. He had, he said, received a vision from the Apostle Andrew, who had revealed to him the location of something hidden beneath the floor of the Church of St. Peter in Antioch. It was the Holy Lance, the Roman spear that had pierced Christ's side at the crucifixion, one of the most sacred relics in Christendom. The reaction to Peter Bartholomew's claim was sharply divided along lines that are very revealing of the tensions within the crusading leadership. Adhemar of Le Puy was sceptical. He was a bishop, an educated man, and he had his own candidate for the Holy Lance, which was allegedly in Constantinople. Raymond of Saint-Gilles, on the other hand, chose to believe, perhaps because his political interests aligned with Provençal credibility, or perhaps because, after months of siege and the terror of their current situation, the idea of miraculous intervention had a power that skepticism could not match. An excavation was organised. Workers dug beneath the floor of the church for hours without result. Finally, Peter Bartholomew himself descended into the trench and, a few moments later, held aloft an iron spearhead. Whether the object that emerged from beneath that church floor was genuinely ancient, genuinely Roman, or genuinely anything other than what Peter Bartholomew had secretly placed there before the digging began, is a question that historians have argued over since the 12th century. The contemporary reaction was itself divided. Some crusaders reported experiencing tremendous spiritual uplift, weeping, praying, feeling as though divine protection had been restored. Adhemar privately maintained his doubts, but the practical effect was real. Something about the discovery, or the theatre of the discovery, galvanized the army. What had been a force paralyzed by desperation began to talk about fighting its way out. The debate in the leadership shifted from how to survive to how to break out and defeat Kerboga. Bohemond, who would be the military commander of any such operation, began planning what seemed like an almost suicidal proposition. His army was significantly outnumbered. His men were sick and hungry. His horses were dead or dying. His opponent had fresh troops and the strategic advantage of surrounding terrain. He had one asset, the psychology of men who believed they were fighting with God. On June 28, 1098, the Crusaders opened the gates of Antioch and marched out to meet Kerboga. The Battle of Antioch on June 28th is one of those moments in history that seems to defy rational military analysis. A sick, outnumbered, undersupplied force attacked a fresh, large, well-positioned army in open ground, and won. The explanations for what happened are various. Bohemond's tactical deployment was intelligent. He moved his divisions in careful order to prevent the Turkish cavalry from finding a flank to exploit, maintaining a compact, mutually supporting formation that was harder to isolate than the Turkish attackers were accustomed to encountering. The Crusaders advanced with the Holy Lance being carried ahead of them, which focused collective emotional energy in a way that must have been visible in their bearing and pace. But Kerboga's own behaviour contributed significantly to the outcome. He had been overconfident, and he made the mistake of watching the initial deployment too long, possibly because he disbelieved that the Crusaders would actually come out and fight, possibly because the appearance of what some chronicles describe as a mounted force on the nearby hills confused him. These mysterious horsemen, described in Crusader accounts as saintly warriors appearing on white horses, interpreted as miraculous intervention, may have been a Byzantine reconnaissance party, or a reflection in shimmering summer heat, or pure elaboration in the telling. But the effect on Kerboga appears to have been hesitation at the critical moment. There were also political fractures within the Muslim coalition. Several of Kerboga's subordinate commanders had deep reservations about his personal authority and ambitions, and when the Crusaders advanced with unexpected aggression, the fragile consensus that held the coalition together collapsed. Units began withdrawing before they were actually threatened. The withdrawal became a rout, the rout became a pursuit, and Kabogga's enormous army disintegrated in an afternoon. The Crusaders stood on a battlefield littered with abandoned equipment, weapons, tents, horses, and supplies, and realized that they had survived. The siege was broken, Kabogga was in flight, Antioch was secured. The exultation was real and immediate, but the army was still hundreds of miles from Jerusalem, still in heavily contested territory, still reduced in numbers and strength from its original departure, and it had no bishop. Adhemar of Le Puy died on August 1st, 1098, a loss that struck the crusade with the force of a personal bereavement. He had been the spiritual heart of the enterprise, the voice of reason and pastoral care among leaders who were perpetually quarrelling with one another. Without him, the fractious political dynamics of the Crusades' leadership became even more difficult to manage. The months following the victory at Antioch were spent in arguments about whether to march immediately on Jerusalem, about Bohemond's claim to Antioch itself, about the relationship with Alexios, about the Holy Lance and its authenticity, about who would command the next phase of the campaign. Peter Bartholomew did not survive the dispute about the lance. Under pressure from continued scepticism, particularly from Arnulf of Choc, a Norman cleric who questioned his visions, Peter Bartholomew agreed to undergo an ordeal by fire to prove the lance's authenticity. He walked through a blazing corridor of burning wood while carrying the lance. He emerged alive, which was interpreted by his supporters as proof. But he had been severely burned in the ordeal, and he died of his injuries 12 days later. His death was interpreted predictably in opposite directions by those who believed and those who did not. Bohemond got Antioch. He managed the political situation with enough skill to outmaneuver Raymond of Saint-Gilles' objections, and the city eventually became the core of the Principality of Antioch, one of the Crusader States that would persist for nearly 2 centuries. He remained in Antioch when the main army finally moved south, citing his need to consolidate his new domain. His role in the conquest of Jerusalem would be played by other hands. The march south resumed in the winter of 1098 to 1099. The army moved through a landscape of political complexity that the Crusaders navigated with mixed results. The Levant they were entering was not a unified Islamic power. It was fragmented among competing rulers whose relationships with one another were frequently hostile. The Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt, which was Shia Muslim and regarded the Sunni Seljuks as heretical enemies, various local emirs controlling individual cities, and smaller principalities of various religions and allegiances. The Fatimids had actually retaken Jerusalem from the Seljuks just months before the Crusaders arrived in the region, a fact that added a layer of irony to the military situation, since the power the Crusaders now faced was not the same power they had set out to fight. Raymond of Saint-Gilles pushed for a rapid advance toward Jerusalem without pausing to besiege every city along the coast. Bohemond's absence left the military leadership more diffuse, and the command relationships were perpetually contested. Some cities along the route, recognizing the military reality of what was advancing toward them, negotiated agreements to supply the army in exchange for not being attacked. This practical arrangement allowed the crusade to move faster but left a string of unconquered cities in its wake. There were atrocities. In December 1098, the Crusaders stormed the village of Marat al-Numan, a fortified settlement in northern Syria whose defenders had refused to surrender. The subsequent slaughter was terrible, and what followed was perhaps even more disturbing. Contemporary Crusader chroniclers, not their enemies, record that during the winter encampment afterward, Crusaders ate the flesh of the Muslim dead. Famine, psychological extremity, or both, the accounts do not provide a definitive explanation, and they have troubled readers ever since. Whether the cannibalism was isolated or more widespread is debated, but its occurrence is not seriously in doubt. The army pressed on. Tripoli, a wealthy coastal city, was bypassed. The city's ruler sent the Crusaders gifts and tried to negotiate their peaceful passage, a pragmatic response to military reality. The Crusaders took what was offered and kept moving. Acre, another fortified town, was besieged for several weeks in the spring of 1099 without result, before the leadership decided the time spent on it was not worth the delay. And then they saw the mountains of Lebanon giving way to the drier, lower terrain of the southern Levant. And ahead of them, Still many miles, but ahead was Jerusalem. The Holy City had been a destination in every sermon preached since Clermont, in every prayer muttered by exhausted men on the Anatolian plateau, in every letter sent home describing the hardships of the march. For the Crusaders, Jerusalem was not simply a political or strategic objective. It was the centre of the spiritual universe, the place where the most important events in human history had occurred, the city that Christ himself had called the city of the great king. The army that approached Jerusalem in June 1099 was a fraction of the force that had left Europe in 1096 and 1097. Months of marching, sieges, battles, disease and desertion had reduced it considerably. By most historical estimates, the force that arrived before Jerusalem numbered perhaps 12,000 fighting men, with an uncertain but significant additional number of non-combatants, pilgrims, and camp followers. Jerusalem in 1099 was governed by Iftikhar ad-Dawla, a Fatimid commander who had taken the city back from the Seljuks the previous year. He had received warning of the Crusaders' approach and had prepared defensively. He expelled the Christian inhabitants of the city, sealed the wells in the surrounding area to deprive the attackers of water, and sent urgent messages to Cairo requesting relief forces. The city's walls were strong and regularly maintained. The garrison was professional and well-equipped. The Fatimid general had every reason to believe that he could hold until help arrived. The Crusaders arrived before the walls on June 7th, 1099. The sight of Jerusalem caused an emotional eruption in the army that defies easy description. Men who had walked thousands of miles, buried comrades, eaten things they would never have imagined eating, nearly died a dozen times over. Men who had held on to the idea of this moment through every horror of the march. These men wept openly. Priests sang. People prostrated themselves on the dusty ground. Some appear to have been temporarily incapacitated by the sheer force of emotion. Raymond of Aguilera, the chaplain of Raymond of Saint-Gilles, who left one of the most important contemporary accounts of the Crusade, describes the scene with an intensity that communicates across 9 centuries. The practical situation rapidly reasserted itself. The army needed to siege the city before the Fatimid relief force arrived, and they needed water desperately. The surrounding countryside had been systematically stripped of anything useful, and the summer heat of the Judean hills was intense. Men were going to die of thirst if water was not found quickly, and the army could not sustain a prolonged siege under these conditions. Patrols found water sources some distance from the city, pools, streams and wells, but the distances were brutal in the heat. Foraging parties went out to find wood for siege equipment, which meant travelling significant distances through terrain that the garrison patrolled with cavalry sorties. The situation was punishing, and the army's leadership knew that time was working against them. The first assault was launched on June 13th, just 6 days after arrival. The attack was disorganised and premature. The Crusaders had not yet built sufficient siege equipment, and the scaling ladders they used were inadequate for the wall height. The defenders repulsed the attack with considerable confidence, pouring boiling oil and water, throwing stones, shooting arrows, and generally demonstrating that they were well prepared to defend a fortified position. The Crusaders withdrew with nothing to show for the attempt except casualties. In the aftermath of the failed assault, a mood of desolation settled over the camp. The water shortage was acute. Men and horses were suffering visibly. The prospect of a prolonged siege seemed impossible given the logistical constraints, but the alternative, abandoning Jerusalem, was unthinkable. Then came the ships. In the second week of June, a Genoese fleet appeared at the port of Jaffa on the Palestinian coast, commanded by a captain named Guglielmo Embriaco. The fleet carried not just food and supplies, but, crucially, carpenters and materials for building siege equipment. The news reached the Crusaders' camp before Jerusalem with the force of answered prayer. The challenge was getting the materials from Jaffa to Jerusalem, a journey of roughly 40 miles through territory that the Fatimid garrison at Jerusalem could raid. A Genoese contingent escorted the equipment overland with some difficulty, and the Crusader army at Jerusalem provided a protective force that fought off several attempts to disrupt the supply line. The construction of siege equipment began in earnest. 2 major siege towers were built. enormous wooden structures on wheels that could be rolled up to the walls, creating a bridge at the level of the battlements from which attackers could cross onto the defensive walkway. Building these towers required enormous quantities of timber, in a landscape almost entirely devoid of trees, which meant sending work parties deep into the surrounding hills to cut down what timber there was. Mangonels, siege catapults, were constructed to bombard the walls and the defenders. Covered galleries to protect approach parties from missile fire were assembled. The work took several weeks of intensive effort. Meanwhile, the spiritual preparation of the army proceeded in parallel. A 3-day fast was proclaimed. Processions circled the walls of the city, with priests and bishops and ordinary crusaders marching in a column that must have looked extraordinary to the defenders watching from above. The procession on July 8th circled the entire city, the crusaders barefoot, praying aloud, their voices carrying up to the walls where the defenders shouted mockery and desecrated the crosses that the crusaders had erected. The mockery of the crosses particularly outraged the crusading soldiers. It was, in its way, more personally motivating than any military calculation. Godfrey of Bouillon commanded the section of the army that would assault the northern wall. Raymond of Saint-Gilles commanded the southern approaches around Mount Zion. In the days before the assault, the siege towers were moved into position, a difficult operation requiring the rolling of these enormous structures over rough terrain, while under fire from the garrison. The final assault was set for the night of July 13th to 14th. The attack began in the dark and continued through the morning hours of July 14th with brutal intensity. The defenders were experienced and determined, and the siege towers were their primary target. Iftikhar's men hurled fire, Greek fire, burning oil, flaming bundles of straw and rags, at the wooden towers, trying to set them ablaze before they could reach the walls. The Crusaders countered with wet hides and vinegar, soaked rags, dousing the fires that broke out on the tower structures. The fighting was close and ugly. Mangonels bombarded the wall sections to drive defenders back from the battlements, long enough for the towers to be pushed into contact. Archers shot up at the wall, walked to provide covering fire. Men struggled to push the towers across the rough ground while under continuous missile fire from above. Raymond's assault on the south wall made some initial progress and then stalled. The southern defences were stronger than anticipated, and his forces lacked the equipment to break through. The real breakthrough came on the northern wall. Godfrey of Bouillon's siege tower reached the northern wall in the mid-morning hours of July 15th, 1099. A bridge was dropped from the tower's upper platform to the battlements, creating the crossing that the tower's design was intended to provide. 2 knights, the sources give the names Letold and Engelbert of Tournai, crossed first and gained a foothold on the wall. Then Godfrey himself crossed. Within minutes, crusading soldiers were flooding over the wall, pouring down into the city, and the defence collapsed. The gate nearest the breach was opened and the main force poured in. Iftikhar's garrison, fighting to the last, was overwhelmed. Some of the defenders retreated to the Tower of David, near the Jaffa Gate, and there Iftikhar negotiated his own surrender with Raymond of Saint-Gilles. The Fatimid commander was given safe conduct and allowed to leave the city with his men. He was perhaps the only notable figure inside Jerusalem who survived that afternoon with any certainty. What followed was a massacre of extraordinary brutality, even by the standards of a brutal century. The Crusaders killed not just the garrison, not just men of military age, but with a broad indiscrimination that included women, children, and the elderly. The Jewish community, which had sheltered in one of the synagogues, was burned out. The Muslim population sought refuge wherever they could find it, but the fury of the attackers was not easily redirected. The accounts are consistent enough in their horror to eliminate any doubt about the essential character of events, even if specific details vary. Crusader sources themselves, writing from within the victorious community, describe scenes that they clearly found disturbing, even as they attempted to justify them as divine judgment. Raymond of Aguiles writes with unsettling calm about wading through blood in the Temple Mount area. Blood, he says, that reached the knees of the horses. Modern historians have debated the literal accuracy of this image, but the emotional truth it encodes, that the killing was on an extraordinary scale, is supported by multiple sources from multiple perspectives. The Temple Mount, the Haram al-Sharif, had been the site of the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock, the third holiest site in Islam, and the site believed to be where Muhammad ascended to heaven during the night journey. Many of the city's Muslim inhabitants had taken refuge there. The Crusaders broke in, and the killing continued. Ibn al-Qalanisi, a chronicler writing in Damascus, describes the events with a grief and fury that communicates across the distance of 9 centuries. The city that had been under Islamic control for over 450 years had fallen, and fallen in a single afternoon, and the news reverberated through the Islamic world with the force of a theological catastrophe. In the immediate aftermath of the conquest, the Crusaders walked through their captured city in a state that mingled exultation and exhaustion, and, for some, what appears to have been a genuine emotional reckoning with what they had done. Eyewitness accounts describe men weeping as they entered the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the great basilica that enclosed the site of the crucifixion and the empty tomb, the single most sacred location in the Christian world. The site of Christ's resurrection had been accessible to Christian pilgrims under Muslim rule, but now it was in Christian hands. The theological framework in which the Crusaders understood what they had done was uncomplicated. God had given them victory. The trials of the journey had been their purification, and the blood that had been shed was the price of a divine judgment. For men who had prayed and fasted and processed barefoot around these walls just a week earlier, the relationship between their faith and the outcome was not something they found difficult to articulate. God wills it. They had said so at Clermont. They had been right. The political questions were more immediately difficult. Who would govern Jerusalem? The question had several dimensions that the crusading leadership had not, in the heat of the campaign, fully resolved. There was the theoretical claim of the papacy. This had been a church enterprise, and some argued that the Pope should govern the Holy City through a patriarch. There was the practical question of which secular lord was capable of defending what had been won. There was the question of Alexios's oath, which theoretically would have entitled the Byzantine Emperor to a claim on lands recovered from the Turks, though the Fatimids were not Turks, a distinction that Bohemond and others were happy to exploit when it served them. On July 22, 1099, the crusading leaders gathered to decide the governance of Jerusalem. The offer was made first to Raymond of Saint-Gilles. He was the wealthiest, the most senior in years, and had been involved in the crusade from near its earliest planning stages. Raymond refused. Whether this was false modesty, genuine piety, he apparently said he would not wear a crown of gold in the city where Christ had worn a crown of thorns, or a calculation that the role without adequate forces to defend it was a poisoned gift, historians have debated. He may have expected a better offer to follow. If so, he miscalculated. The electors turned to Godfrey of Bouillon. Godfrey also declined the title of king, but for different reasons. He accepted governance of the city and the title Advocate of the Holy Sepulchre, a title that placed him as the protector of the sacred sites, rather than a sovereign in the conventional sense. This was almost certainly a deliberate humility before the kingship of Christ, whom Godfrey acknowledged as the true king of Jerusalem. But in practical terms, Godfrey of Bouillon was the ruler of what would become the Kingdom of Jerusalem. He had very little time to enjoy the position. The Fatimid Caliph in Cairo had dispatched a relief army before Jerusalem fell, and it arrived at Ascalon, the fortified coastal city south of Jerusalem, just weeks after the Crusaders had taken the Holy City. The army was commanded by Al-Afdal Shahanshah, the Vizier of Egypt, and it was a substantial force accompanied by an enormous baggage train that suggested confidence in an extended campaign. Godfrey moved quickly. Despite the exhausted condition of his troops, despite the enormous losses of the campaign, he led the crusading army south before the Fatimid force could advance. On August 12, 1099, the two armies met on the coastal plain near Ascalon. The Battle of Ascalon was relatively brief but decisive. The Fatimid army, which had not expected to face the Crusaders so quickly and may not have been fully deployed, was struck by a cavalry charge that broke its formation before it could organise a response. The vizier fled toward Ascalon. The Fatimid army disintegrated. The Crusaders captured an enormous quantity of equipment, animals, food, and treasure. The haul was so substantial that contemporary accounts stagger under the weight of describing it. Ascalon itself was within reach, and a bold push might have taken it. But the political divisions that had plagued the entire enterprise now produced their most immediately consequential consequence. Raymond of Saint-Gilles, who had never accepted Godfrey's authority with good grace, and who was nursing the grievance of having been passed over for the governance of Jerusalem, refused to cooperate in the assault on Ascalon. The city's garrison had apparently offered to surrender to Raymond personally, and when he brought this offer to Godfrey, the resulting quarrel was fierce enough that the opportunity was lost. Ascalon remained in Fatimid hands, a consequence of Crusader politics that would have military implications for decades. Godfrey returned to Jerusalem. He had much to organise and very little time. Most of the Crusaders, having fulfilled their vow by reaching Jerusalem, prepared to go home. The army that had conquered the Holy City began dissolving almost immediately. Individuals, contingents, and ultimately entire national groups began the long journey back to their homelands, telling a story that would be retold for generations. What remained in Jerusalem and the surrounding region was a tiny garrison in the most exposed possible strategic position, holding a string of fortifications with a population that was a fraction of what it had been before the conquest, and a vast hostile hinterland on all sides. Godfrey of Bouillon died on July 18th, 1100, probably of typhoid, less than a year after the conquest. He was in his early 40s. His achievement was to have kept the enterprise alive long enough to be handed on. The governance of Jerusalem passed to his brother Baldwin, the same Baldwin who had carved out the county of Edessa, and Baldwin, unlike Godfrey, had no compunction about taking the title of king. He was crowned on Christmas Day 1100 in the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. The kingdom of Jerusalem had acquired its first king. But the story of the First Crusade does not end with the conquest of Jerusalem. To understand what was actually achieved and what was left unfinished requires following the longer arc of consequences that radiated from those events in the summer of 1099. The Crusaders had established, against what seems in retrospect like overwhelming odds, a chain of Christian principalities along the eastern Mediterranean coast. Besides the county of Edessa and the emerging kingdom of Jerusalem, Bohemont's principality of Antioch was taking shape, and Raymond of Saint-Gilles, with characteristic stubbornness, was in the process of establishing what would become the county of Tripoli, which he would siege for years before his death in 1105. These four entities, the Crusader States, as they came to be called, were strung along a narrow coastal strip and surrounded on three sides by far more populous and, in the long run, far more powerful Islamic polities. Their survival required constant military activity, perpetual reinforcement from the West, and a degree of diplomatic sophistication that coexisted uneasily with the religious absolutism that had generated the enterprise. The society that developed in the Crusader states was stranger and more complex than the rhetoric of holy war might suggest. Crusaders who settled permanently in the region, the Poulains, as they came to be called, the people of the land, found themselves adapting to local conditions in ways that horrified fresh arrivals from Europe. They ate different food, wore different clothing, adopted different medicines, employed Muslim servants, contracted commercial relationships with Muslim merchants, and in some cases learned Arabic. The cultural transfer was not unidirectional. Elements of Levantine material culture, medicine, architecture, and agricultural practice flowed back to Europe through returning pilgrims and merchants. The relationship between the settler population and the local communities they governed was complicated and varied. Christian, Jewish, and Muslim communities lived in proximity to each other in many parts of the kingdom, with legal and social arrangements that were pragmatic rather than ideological. The Muslim population that had survived the conquest of Jerusalem was initially expelled, but as the years passed and the kingdom's need for agricultural labour became evident, Muslim farmers and artisans returned to many areas under arrangements that resembled feudal serfdom. The kingdom's Syrian and Armenian Christian communities often served as intermediaries, translators, administrators, commercial brokers between the Frankish rulers and the indigenous population. The architecture of the Crusader States reflected this cultural complexity with unusual literalness. Frankish builders constructed castles and churches in styles that drew on Norman, Byzantine, Armenian, and local Syrian traditions simultaneously. The great castles of Outremer, the name the Franks gave to their eastern territories, like Crac des Chevaliers, which the military orders would later develop into one of the most formidable fortifications in the medieval world, combined Western European defensive principles with local adaptations for climate and terrain. Churches were built over earlier Byzantine structures, which had often been built over classical temples or Jewish shrines. The military orders that emerged from this environment were among the most distinctive institutions of the crusading world. The Knights Hospitaller had their origins in a hospital in Jerusalem predating the Crusade that cared for sick pilgrims, but they rapidly militarized under the pressures of the kingdom's defensive situation. The Knights Templar were founded around 1119 by a French knight named Hugh of Paynes and a small group of companions who took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience while committing themselves to the military defense of pilgrims in the Holy Land. These two orders, and the Teutonic Knights who followed later, combined monastic discipline with military function in a way that was theologically novel and practically extremely effective. They could be relied upon to fight when secular lords were squabbling, they held key castles, and they provided a form of institutional continuity that outlasted individual rulers and generations. The economic dimensions of the Crusader States deserve attention because they fundamentally altered the commercial geography of the medieval Mediterranean. The ports of Acre, Jaffa, Tyre, and others became nodes in a trading network that connected European markets with the luxury goods of the East: spices, silks, dyes, glassware, and ceramics. The Italian city-states of Genoa, Venice, and Pisa had provided the naval support that made the crusade logistically possible, and they extracted substantial commercial privileges in return: rights to maintain their own quarters in the major ports, to conduct trade under favourable tariff conditions, to govern their own communities by their own laws. These arrangements were the seeds of a commercial transformation that would ultimately produce the European trading networks of the late medieval and early modern periods. Pilgrimage continued on an enormous scale. The road to Jerusalem, which had been the original justification for the crusade, was now in Christian hands, and the flow of pilgrims became a significant economic and cultural phenomenon. People of all social levels made the journey: kings and queens, bishops, merchants, artisans, and peasants who had saved for years to afford the passage. The pilgrimage infrastructure of hospitals, hostels, and churches that developed along the route reflected the scale of this movement, and the pilgrims who returned brought back physical relics, written accounts, memories, and cultural influences that permeated European society. In the Islamic world, the fall of Jerusalem registered with a shock that took time to fully process. The immediate military response, the failed relief attempt at Ascalon, had revealed the fragmentation and mutual hostility of the regional Islamic powers that had made the Crusade's success possible. The various Seljuk rulers who controlled Syria and the Upper Mesopotamia were far more concerned with their rivalry with one another and with the Fatimid Caliphate than with a common response to the Christian conquest. The Fatimids regarded the Seljuks as heretics, and the Seljuks reciprocated the contempt. The idea of a unified Islamic response to the Crusader states would have required a political transformation that the immediate situation could not produce. The Islamic chroniclers who wrote about the First Crusade and its immediate aftermath reveal a world that was processing a profound humiliation. Ibn al-Qalanisi, the Damascus chronicler, provides the most detailed contemporary Islamic account. His description of the fall of Jerusalem is anguished and precise, recording the killing, the displacement, the desecration of the mosques. He notes the gathering of refugees from the holy city in Damascus, and the prayers and lamentations that marked their arrival. But the Islamic world also showed a capacity for adaptation and eventual response that the Crusaders would come to appreciate over the following decades. The message from Jerusalem that arrived in Baghdad and Cairo was not simply grief. It was, for those who could read it as such, a call to a military and spiritual reconstitution. The process would take time, most of the 12th century, but it would ultimately produce rulers like Zengi of Mosul, Nur ad-Din, and then Saladin, men who understood that the theological and military unification of the Islamic world was the prerequisite for recovering what had been lost. The vocabulary of jihad, holy war in defense of Islam, had existed before the Crusades, but the Crusade gave it a new urgency and a specific direction. Preachers in Damascus and Cairo and Baghdad began articulating the loss of Jerusalem in terms that mirrored, almost exactly, the theological framework the Crusaders had used to justify taking it. This was a sacred city, divinely significant, whose recovery was a religious obligation. The symmetry of these competing sacred claims on the same geography would define the next several centuries of Middle Eastern history. The legacy of the First Crusade is complicated in ways that simple heroism or simple villainy cannot accommodate. In purely military and political terms, the Crusade achieved its stated objective with a completeness that surprised contemporaries and has surprised historians ever since. A force that had no guarantee of resupply from home, that was fighting across thousands of miles of hostile territory, that was fractured by political rivalries and religious disputes, managed to capture the two most significant cities in their path, Antioch and Jerusalem, and establish a territorial presence that lasted in various forms for nearly 200 years. By the standards of medieval military enterprise, this was extraordinary. The human cost was enormous on all sides. The death toll from the campaign itself, military dead, civilian dead, those who died from disease and starvation during the march, will never be accurately known. Medieval demography is imprecise even for well-documented populations, and the regions affected by the First Crusade were not exhaustively documented. Historians estimate that the Jewish communities of the Rhineland alone lost perhaps several thousand people to the pogroms of 1096. The civilian populations of Antioch and Jerusalem suffered large-scale killing. Muslim and Jewish inhabitants of cities that the Crusaders stormed were systematically slaughtered in patterns that followed the military logic of the era. An enemy that refused to surrender had, by the accepted conventions of siege warfare, forfeited the right to mercy, but which produced outcomes that any honest accounting must acknowledge as catastrophic. The Crusade also produced a theological and cultural legacy that shaped European Christianity for centuries. The concept of the Holy War, the war that carried spiritual merit for its participants, was reinforced and elaborated by the First Crusade in ways that echoed through subsequent centuries of European history. The idea that Christians could and should use armed force in defense of the faith, properly authorized by ecclesiastical authority, and that participants would receive spiritual benefit for doing so, became a permanent part of the Western Christian conceptual toolkit. Its applications extended far beyond the Holy Land. The Crusade generated a literature of remarkable richness and variety. The chronicles written by participants and near contemporaries, the Gesta Francorum, the Historia Hieronymitana of Fulcher of Chartres, the Historia Francorum of Raymond of Aguilera, the Alexiad of Anna Komnena, provide multiple perspectives on the same events from positions ranging from devout justification to cool Byzantine analysis. These accounts are primary sources of irreplaceable historical value, and they are also, in their different ways, literary achievements, narratives of adventure, faith, suffering and triumph that capture something of the human experience of the Crusade with an immediacy that later, more polished accounts cannot replicate. The vernacular literature that grew from the Crusades, the chansons de geste, the romances, the Crusade cycles, shaped the European literary imagination in ways that are still traceable today. The image of the armoured knight on a sacred quest, the idea of spiritual purpose finding expression through martial action, the landscape of the Holy Land as a terrain of theological significance. These became common property of the Western imagination in a way that the Crusade made possible. To stand in Jerusalem today is to stand in a city that still carries the weight of what happened in 1099. The old city's geography reflects layers of construction that mark the passage of centuries: Crusader churches built over Byzantine structures, Mamluk buildings adjacent to Crusader walls, Ottoman additions atop medieval foundations. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which has been reconstructed and modified many times since the Crusaders first entered it, still draws millions of pilgrims annually from Orthodox, Catholic, Armenian, Coptic and Ethiopian Christian traditions. The Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount, which the Crusaders briefly converted to Christian use before Saladin restored them to Islamic worship in 1187, are among the most visited religious sites on earth. The Western Wall, the Kotel, which is all that remains of the retaining wall of the Second Temple, is a place of Jewish prayer and memory that predates all of these events by 1,000 years and endures through all of them. The city is simultaneously the most sacred and the most fought over piece of real estate on the planet. The First Crusaders understood it that way. The people who live in its orbit today understand it the same way. Whatever conclusions one draws about the First Crusade, and legitimate conclusions can range widely, it was not a footnote. It was a fulcrum. Godfrey of Bouillon died too soon to see the kingdom he had founded take shape. Baldwin I, who built it into something durable, was a different kind of man, more pragmatic, more politically calculating, willing to use diplomacy where force was unavailing, and to contract marriages, alliances, and commercial agreements that would have seemed impure to the more rigidly pious crusaders of the first generation. He expanded the kingdom's territory through a series of campaigns that gave it more defensible borders, captured the coastal cities that controlled trade and communication, and created the administrative infrastructure of a functioning state. The Latin Church of the East, which administered the spiritual life of the Crusader States, was in constant creative tension with the indigenous Christian communities, the Eastern Orthodox, the Maronite, the Armenian and the Syriac Christians who had lived in the region for centuries and who regarded the Latin liturgical practices with a mixture of curiosity and occasional hostility. The relationship between the Roman Rite Latin Church and these older Eastern traditions was never fully resolved during the Crusader period, and the attempt to impose Latin ecclesiastical authority over ancient Eastern churches generated resentment that complicated the Crusader states' relationship with local populations. The Knights of the Hospital of St. John operated the Great Hospital in Jerusalem that had been caring for sick pilgrims since before the Crusade, and in the generation after 1099 it developed into an institution of remarkable sophistication. Contemporary accounts describe a hospital capable of caring for hundreds of patients simultaneously, with a medical staff that drew on both Western European and Islamic medical knowledge, the latter being, in the 12th century, considerably more advanced than the former in many respects. Patients were provided food, medicine, and nursing care without charge, regardless of their religion. The hospital's operations were funded by donations from across Europe, whose kings and nobles sent substantial grants in recognition of its service to pilgrims. The commercial vitality of the Crusader ports was a significant feature of the kingdom's early decades. Acre, which became the primary commercial port, hosted a Venetian quarter, a Genoese quarter, and a Pisan quarter, each governed by its own laws, with its own church, bathhouse, market, and legal system. The arrangement was cumbersome and generated conflicts between the merchant communities, but it also created an extraordinarily cosmopolitan trading centre, where merchants from dozens of different backgrounds conducted business in a polyglot environment. The spice trade that passed through these ports ultimately connected the markets of the Indian Ocean basin with the consumers of Northern Europe, and the commercial techniques, letters of credit, partnership agreements, insurance contracts, that developed to facilitate this trade were the ancestors of modern commercial law. The question of military manpower was always the Crusader states' most pressing problem. The original Crusades participants had largely gone home. The kingdom depended on an influx of new crusaders and pilgrims who might choose to stay on the military orders and on such indigenous allies as could be cultivated. The Byzantine Empire provided occasional assistance but was itself under pressure from multiple directions. The relationship between the Crusader States and their neighbours was not purely one of conflict. Commercial and even diplomatic relationships existed with Muslim rulers in contexts where shared interest overrode religious hostility. The Assassins, the Nizari Ismaili sect led from their mountain fortress of Alamut in Persia, were at various points in a strange working relationship with the Crusader States, since both shared enemies among the dominant Sunni Muslim powers. The history of relations between the Crusader States and their Islamic neighbours was not a simple story of permanent warfare, but a complex dance of alliance, hostility, commerce, and cultural exchange that defies reduction to the binary of Christian versus Muslim. The echoes of 1099 reached far beyond the military and political. The Crusade transformed the intellectual life of Europe in ways that were not immediately obvious, but proved lasting. The encounter with the more sophisticated scientific and philosophical traditions of the Islamic world, which had preserved and extended classical Greek knowledge during the centuries when Western Europe had largely lost access to it, accelerated what historians have called the 12th century Renaissance. Arabic medical texts, astronomical tables, mathematical treatises and philosophical works flowed westward through the ports of the Crusader States and through the parallel process of translation occurring in Sicily and Spain. The works of Aristotle, which would eventually reshape Western philosophy and theology, came to Western Europe significantly through Arabic translations made available through the contact that the Crusades, among other developments, facilitated. The Crusade also altered the economic geography of Europe in ways with long-term consequences. The Italian city-states that had provided crucial naval and commercial support for the Crusade received their payment in trade privileges that made them the dominant commercial powers of the Mediterranean for centuries. Venice, Genoa, and Pisa each established trading networks that stretched from the Black Sea to the Atlantic and enriched them far beyond what their limited territorial base would otherwise have permitted. The commercial techniques they developed, double-entry bookkeeping, sophisticated credit instruments, cargo insurance, joint stock commercial partnerships, eventually diffused through the European economy and contributed to the commercial and ultimately industrial transformations of subsequent centuries. The military technology of the Crusade also had reverberations. Western European knights encountered in the Seljuk Turks an adversary whose tactics, mobile cavalry, composite bows, feigned retreats, were fundamentally different from anything they had faced in European warfare, and the adaptation of Western military practice to counter these tactics influenced medieval European military thought. The great siege engines of the Crusade, some of them designed with input from Byzantine and local engineers, reflected a synthesis of multiple traditions that produced genuinely innovative military technology. Pope Urban II, who had called the Crusade at Clermont, died on July 29, 1099, 2 weeks after Jerusalem fell. The news of the Holy City's capture had not yet reached Rome by the time of his death. He died not knowing that the great enterprise he had launched had achieved its stated objective. This detail carries an odd poignancy. The man whose words had set 3,000 miles of human history in motion, who had articulated a vision of divine purpose so compelling that it moved armies across continents, left the world before he could know whether the vision had been realized. History does not always arrange itself to provide closure even to its most consequential actors. What Urban had intended and what was actually produced were not the same thing, though they overlapped considerably. He had wanted a military expedition to assist Alexios and recover the Holy Land. He had gotten that, plus pogroms in the Rhineland, plus the massacre of Jerusalem, plus the establishment of Crusader States that would create 4 centuries of conflict, plus a transformation of the relationship between Europe and the Islamic world that is still working itself out. The unintended consequences of great historical events are often more significant than what was intended. The First Crusade is an excellent case in point. Alexios Komnenos had wanted military assistance and got a crusade. The distinction was significant. The relationship between the Byzantine Empire and the Crusader States that emerged from the enterprise was never comfortable and often actively hostile. Bohemond of Antioch went to war with the Byzantine Empire in 1107, leading a Western force across the Adriatic in an attack that Alexios repulsed decisively. The Crusader lords regarded the oath they had sworn with varying degrees of seriousness, and Alexios regarded the failure to honour it, particularly Bohemond's retention of Antioch, as a profound betrayal of the terms under which Byzantine assistance had been extended. Anna Komnena's Alexiad, written decades later, reflects the complicated legacy of this relationship. Anna is a sophisticated historian with a sharp eye for character and motivation, and her account of the crusading leaders she observed in Constantinople during the winter of 1096 to 1097 is among the most vivid character sketches we have. She admires some of them. Godfrey of Bouillon's physical presence impresses her. Bohemond she describes with a fascination that is almost against her will. But she is consistently clear that from the Byzantine perspective, the crusade was a double-edged instrument. It helped push the Turks back from the imperial frontier, but it also introduced into the region a set of Western powers with their own agenda that was not always compatible with Byzantine interests. The theological relationship between Rome and Constantinople that the Crusade was supposed, in some vague way, to improve did not improve substantially. The Byzantine Orthodox Church maintained its theological objections to Roman primacy, and the occasional cooperative moments during the Crusade era did not overcome the fundamental doctrinal and jurisdictional disputes that had produced the Great Schism of 1054. The Fourth Crusade of 1202 to 1204, which ended not in the Holy Land but in the sack of Constantinople by Western Crusaders, represented the nadir of a relationship that the First Crusade had begun to complicate. The memory of the First Crusade in the European imagination underwent constant revision from the moment it concluded. Almost immediately, the enterprise was the subject of poetry, history, and theological reflection that shaped how subsequent generations understood what had happened. The histories written by participants were copied, translated, and widely distributed. Vernacular accounts based on these histories reached audiences that could not read Latin. The First Crusade became the template against which all subsequent crusading was measured, the standard by which later enterprises were found wanting. The remarkable fact that an improbably difficult military objective had been achieved was attributed by almost all contemporary commentators to divine assistance. The battles that should have been lost and were won, the sieges that should have been broken by relief forces and were not, the providential timing of the Genoese fleet at Jaffa, these were read as evidence of God's active intervention in history on behalf of the Christian cause. This interpretive framework was not cynical. It reflected a genuinely widespread belief in divine providence that was central to the medieval European worldview. The Islamic world's memory of the First Crusade also underwent revision, though on a longer timeline. In the immediate aftermath, the primary response was political. The need to respond militarily and diplomatically to the new reality of Crusader states on the eastern Mediterranean coast. But over the following century, as the various Zengid and then Ayyubid rulers built the military and political capacity to push back against the Crusaders, the memory of Jerusalem's fall became an increasingly important motivating narrative. Saladin, who recovered Jerusalem in 1187, understood perfectly well the symbolic power of the memory of 1099, and he played it deliberately, both as a justification for his campaigns and as a rhetorical tool in the correspondence he conducted with European rulers. The recovery of Jerusalem in 1187 produced a mirror image of 1099 in some respects, a city taken by a conquering army, a population that had reason to fear massacre, an outcome that was shaped by the decision of the conquering general about how to treat civilians. Saladin's decision to allow the Latin Christian population of Jerusalem to ransom themselves and leave safely, in sharp contrast to what had happened in 1099, was both a genuine expression of his values and a carefully considered political statement. He knew what 1099 had looked like to the Islamic world, and he knew what his treatment of Jerusalem's population in 1187 would look like, in contrast. The First Crusade's relationship with Judaism is a chapter of the story that cannot be passed over without full acknowledgement. The massacres of Jewish communities in the Rhineland in 1096, what Jewish historical memory calls the Zerot Tatnu, the persecutions of the year 4856 of the Hebrew calendar, were a traumatic rupture in the relationship between Jewish communities and the broader society around them. The Jews of Worms, Mainz, Cologne, and other Rhineland cities had lived in varying degrees of integration with their Christian neighbours for generations. In the spring of 1096, the combination of crusading religious excitement and anti-Jewish ideology produced massacres that killed several thousand people and left the survivors in a state of community devastation and grief. The Hebrew chronicles of these massacres, the accounts written by survivors and their descendants, are among the most harrowing texts of medieval literature. They describe communities facing impossible choices: conversion or death. Many chose death, or chose to take their own lives and the lives of their children, rather than face forced baptism or killing at the hands of crusading mobs. The texts frame these choices in the language of Kiddush Hashem, the sanctification of God's name through martyrdom, drawing on the theological resources of a tradition that had survived earlier persecutions to find meaning in the current catastrophe. These events are not tangential to the First Crusade. They were produced by the same forces that produced the Crusade itself, and they illustrate with particular clarity the difference between the controlled enterprise that Urban II had intended and the forces that enterprise had unleashed. The pogroms were not authorized by the Pope or by the Crusade's formal leadership, and some ecclesiastical authorities, as noted, actively tried to prevent them. But they were not surprising. The theological framework of the Crusade, the recovery of holy sites from the enemies of Christ, provided intellectual justification, however attenuated, for violence against non-Christians in general, and the Jewish communities of Europe lived in the immediate vicinity of the crusading enthusiasm, unlike the distant Muslims of Palestine. The legal and social position of Jewish communities in Europe after 1096 was never quite the same as before. The massacres had demonstrated with brutal clarity how contingent the protection that Jewish communities enjoyed under Christian rulers actually was. The elaborate legal arrangements, charters of protection issued by emperors and bishops, had proven insufficient against aroused religious mobs. The psychology of vulnerability that shaped Jewish communal life in medieval Europe was deepened by the events of 1096, even as the communities rebuilt and continued. The Crusades' impact on the papacy was profound and lasting. Urban II had demonstrated that the Pope, properly positioned, could mobilize Christian Europe for a shared enterprise on a scale that no secular ruler could match. This demonstration of soft power, the ability to direct the energy and resources of an entire civilization, was intoxicating for the papacy, and subsequent popes returned to the well again and again. The Second Crusade, 1147 to 1149, the Third Crusade, 1189 to 1192, the Fourth Crusade, 1202 to 1204, and the various later enterprises that took the Crusade name and framework represent the institutionalization of an idea that Urban had essentially invented at Clermont in 1095. The problem was that the conditions that had made the First Crusade possible, a specific moment of religious excitement, a clearly defined objective, a relatively coherent motivation among the participants, and a degree of providential good fortune that even secular historians find remarkable, were not replicable. The later Crusades generally had less success, more complex politics, and significantly more internal conflict. The papacy's repeated invocations of the crusading framework to solve problems that were not really the same kind of problem eventually diluted the concept's power. By the 13th century, crusading indulgences were being applied to wars against heretics in southern France and against the Pope's political enemies in Italy, in a theological extension that many contemporaries found troubling. The eventual loss of the Crusader States, culminating in the fall of Acre in 1291, 200 years after the First Crusade had established them, produced a crisis of faith and self-examination in European Christendom. If God had blessed the conquest of 1099, what did the loss of 1291 mean? The theological responses to this question range from the argument that Christians had been insufficiently devout to maintain God's favour, to more uncomfortable suggestions that the entire enterprise had perhaps been misconceived. The later medieval literature of Crusade theory and criticism reflects this unease. Let us return, for a moment, to the individuals. There is a tendency in military history to describe events in terms of the movement of armies and the decisions of leaders, which is accurate and necessary, but can obscure the human texture of what those movements and decisions actually involved. The First Crusade was not only armies, it was individual people who made individual choices that were shaped by the specific circumstances of their lives and the cultural world that had formed them. Consider the anonymous knight, the minor vassal, who sewed a cross of cloth onto his shoulder at some regional church after hearing Urban's message conveyed by a travelling preacher. He may have had no particular land to mortgage, he was too poor to have any. He may have had debts of his own, obligations to a local lord, a family that depended on him. The theological argument that this journey would clear his spiritual record entirely was not, for him, an abstraction. He genuinely feared hell. The medieval fear of death and its consequences was not a performance of piety. It was a constant presence in a world where life expectancy was short, disease was unpredictable, and the torments described in sermon literature were understood to be literal descriptions of what awaited the insufficiently repentant. He walked to Clermont, or to wherever he heard the preaching, and he decided to go. He spent weeks or months in preparation that required the assistance of his community. He said goodbye to people he might never see again. Most people who went on the First Crusade never came home. He walked out of his village and toward a destination he knew only from scripture and sermon. What the anonymous knight encountered on the road to Jerusalem was not the clean, providential narrative that the preachers had described. It was mud and hunger and thirst and the constant reality of physical suffering. It was watching companions die of disease in camp outside Antioch and wondering whether God was actually present in this enterprise, or whether the suffering was punishment for sin. It was fighting in the hills above Jerusalem with the knowledge that he might not survive the day. It was entering a city, the holy city, in a moment of overwhelming emotion followed by the immediate reality of what armies do to cities they have just taken by storm. And then, for those who survived, it was the long walk home, the journey back across Anatolia, across the Bosphorus, through the Balkans, across Hungary and France, back to the village where the people who had stayed, who had not gone, who had perhaps thought the idea was madness, asked what it had been like, and the survivor had to find words for something that defied ordinary language, the greatest adventure in medieval European history, the most terrible suffering, the most extraordinary outcome, and the persistent question of whether it had been worth what it cost. Some survivors settled in the new territories, many more went home. A few wrote about what they had seen, in Latin for the educated audience or in French for those who would hear it sung or recited. Their accounts, even the most polished and rhetorically sophisticated, carry beneath the surface the raw material of lived experience, the specific detail, the unexpected observation, the moment of emotion that no one would have thought to include if they were making it up. The landscape of the Crusades' geography retains traces of what happened there, even now. The plain of Dorylaeum in western Anatolia is agricultural land today, and the bones of those who fell there in July 1097 are part of its soil. The Orontes River Valley, where the Crusaders camped for 8 months outside Antioch's walls, is still a productive agricultural region, and the city of Antakya, Antioch's modern successor, still has sections of the original Byzantine walls that the Crusaders saw when they arrived. The great siege tower that Bohemond rolled against those walls is long gone, but the walls themselves endure. Jerusalem's old city still walks the streets that the first Crusaders walked, though the streets themselves have been rebuilt many times. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre has been reconstructed, modified, burned, and rebuilt repeatedly over the centuries, but it stands on the same ground that the Crusaders entered in July 1099 with tears running down their faces. The Tower of David, where Iftikhar negotiated his surrender with Raymond of Saint-Gilles, is a museum today, and one of the most photogenic landmarks in a city that does not lack for landmarks. The Crusader castles of the Levant, Crac des Chevaliers in Syria, Belvoir and Nimrod in Israel, Kerak in Jordan, are among the most impressive medieval fortifications in the world, and they stand largely as testimony to the architectural energy of a settler society that understood it was living on a permanent frontier and built accordingly. They are places where the physical reality of the Crusader period is most directly accessible to a modern observer. The scale of the walls, the ingenuity of the defensive arrangements, the evidence of the resources that were invested in these remote strongholds. Urban II's speech at Clermont had mentioned the suffering of Eastern Christians as a justification for the Crusade, and that suffering was real. The Seljuk advance had disrupted Christian communities throughout Anatolia and Syria. But the relationship between the Western Crusade and the Eastern Christians it claimed to be helping was rarely straightforward. The Byzantine Christians of Anatolia, the Armenian Christians of the Eastern Frontier, and the Syriac Christians of Syria and Iraq each had their own complex histories and political situations that the Crusaders were ill-equipped to understand and sometimes actively worsened. The Armenian Christians of Cilicia and the Edessa region found in the Crusade an opportunity that some of them seized with considerable sophistication. The Armenian Prince Thoros of Edessa's decision to adopt Baldwin of Boulogne, whatever the precise motivations and however we interpret the subsequent events, reflected a recognition that the Crusade could be used as a counterweight to Turkish pressure. Armenian communities in Cilicia would eventually establish the Armenian Kingdom of Cilicia, a Christian state that maintained complex relationships with both the Crusader states and the surrounding Islamic powers for the next 2 centuries. The Syriac Christians, the communities of the Jacobite and Nestorian churches, whose theological traditions diverged from both Rome and Constantinople, found themselves in an ambiguous position under Crusader rule. The Latin church that came with the Crusaders was not their church. The Crusaders' religious enthusiasm could be directed against them as readily as against Muslims when theological differences became politically charged. But they also found that the Crusader presence provided some protection against the pressures they had faced under Seljuk rule, and the intellectual exchanges between Syriac scholars and the Western newcomers contributed to the transmission of scientific and philosophical knowledge that would prove so consequential for European intellectual history. The figure of Peter the Hermit, who had preached the People's Crusade with such devastating consequences, eventually completed the journey to Jerusalem that the People's Crusade had so catastrophically failed to make. He participated in the later stages of the main crusade, apparently recovered from the humiliation of his capture after desertion, and is reported to have been present for the liberation of Jerusalem. He returned to Europe afterward and founded a monastery in Huy, in what is now Belgium, where he died in 1115. His legacy is complicated. He inspired hundreds of thousands of people with a religious vision of extraordinary power. That inspiration produced the pogroms of the Rhineland, the chaos of the People's Crusade, and thousands of deaths in Anatolia. It also produced genuine acts of faith and sacrifice. People who gave up everything they had because they believed in something larger than themselves. Whether those competing outcomes can be morally balanced is a question that does not yield to simple arithmetic. The other great personalities of the Crusade met various ends. Bohemond of Antioch, the shrewdest and most ambitious of the commanders, was captured by the Danish men Turks in 1100 during a separate campaign and held for ransom for 3 years. A reversal of fortune that demonstrated how precarious his position always was. Released, he went back to Europe, married the daughter of the King of France in a ceremony of tremendous pomp, recruited forces for a crusade against Byzantium, still nursing his quarrel with Alexios, and was defeated. He returned to Antioch, governed it for a few more years, and died in 1111. His tomb in Canossa di Puglia, in southern Italy, is a remarkable monument. A Muslim craftsman made it, which tells you something about the complex cultural world of the Norman south. Raymond of Saint-Gilles, the stubborn, wealthy, difficult Count of Toulouse, died in 1105 while besieging the city of Tripoli, a siege that had consumed the last years of his life. The city fell eventually to his descendants, and the county of Tripoli bearing his name persisted for nearly 2 centuries. His extraordinary stubbornness, which had made him so difficult to work with during the Crusade itself, kept him in the east when others went home. and the territory he refused to abandon became one of the 4 Crusader States. Godfrey of Bouillon's memory was treated with particular reverence by later tradition. He became, in the centuries after his death, the ideal image of the crusading knight, devout, chivalric, effective in battle and generous in peace. Some of this was certainly mythologizing. The real Godfrey was more complicated. But the memory served a purpose. It gave the crusading movement an exemplar whose image could inspire subsequent generations. The economy of the crusade itself, the financing, the logistics, the commercial relationships that made it possible, deserves close attention because the enterprise did not materialize from pure faith. It required money on an enormous scale, and the question of how that money was raised tells us something important about the social and economic structures of 11th century Europe. The crusading lords sold or mortgaged land to fund their expeditions. Godfrey of Bouillon's mortgaging of the Duchy of Bouillon to the Bishop of Liège for a substantial sum of silver was not unusual. Virtually every major leader of the crusade raised money through similar mechanisms. This had immediate effects on the credit markets of Western Europe, and longer-term effects on the distribution of land. Some of the lords who went did not come back, or came back much reduced in resources, and the lands that had been pledged as security changed hands permanently. The crusade produced a redistribution of property that reshaped local economies in various regions of France, Lorraine, Flanders, and the Norman lands. The monasteries and churches of Europe were significant players in this financing. They purchased crusader lands, accepted property as gifts in exchange for prayers for the crusaders' safety and souls, and served as safe depositories for goods and documents left behind by departing crusaders. The spiritual services the church provided, masses, prayers, memorial services for the dead, were both genuine pastoral care and an economic transaction that transferred wealth from the secular to the ecclesiastical sphere. The crusade, among its many other effects, accelerated the accumulation of landed property by monasteries that was already a significant feature of European economic life. The ordinary crusaders, the people below the level of the great lords who paid for themselves and their immediate followers, financed their participation through a variety of mechanisms that range from selling personal property to borrowing from Jewish moneylenders, which is one of the dark ironies of the Rhineland pogroms. People who had borrowed from Jews to fund their participation in the crusade then participated in or failed to prevent the killing of their creditors. Some crusaders received support from their lords as a matter of feudal obligation. A lord who committed to the crusade might provision and equip the fighting men of his territory as part of their contractual relationship. Women crusaders and the role of women in the enterprise is a subject that conventional military history has sometimes minimized. Women did travel with the crusade in considerable numbers, and their roles were varied and significant. Some were wives of crusading lords, accompanying their husbands on what the whole family understood as a great pilgrimage. Some were servants or camp followers, providing labour that the army required. A few were participants in combat. The sources make occasional reference to women fighting or taking on military roles during moments of particular crisis, though these references are often ambiguous and may partly reflect the rhetorical goals of the writers who recorded them. More systematically, women provided nursing care, water carrying during battles, the repair of equipment, and the daily labour of making an army functional that is entirely invisible in the battle narratives but absolutely essential to what the army could accomplish. The spiritual experience of female crusaders has left relatively few traces in the documentary record, which was created mostly by literate men. But the letters and the legal documents, wills, property agreements, deeds of sale, that surround the crusade give occasional glimpses of women making independent decisions about crusade participation, managing family property in the absence of crusading husbands, and navigating the legal and social landscape of communities emptied of many of their adult men by the enterprise. The children who accompanied the crusade, some as servants, some as the children of crusading families who could not be left behind, some perhaps as participants in their own right driven by the same combination of faith and desperation that moved their parents, are even less visible in the record. Their presence is acknowledged in passing by various chronicles, but their individual experiences are largely inaccessible. The child who survived the march from Dorylaeum to Antioch, who watched adults die of thirst on the Anatolian plateau, who heard the sounds of the siege through a year of monotony and terror. This child grew into an adult who carried the memory of the First Crusade as a lived experience, not a historical narrative. What they made of it is something we can only imagine. The religious life of the crusading camp was rich, perpetual, and deeply intertwined with the military enterprise in ways that make the separation of spiritual and practical motivation artificial. The Mass was celebrated daily in the camp, and the confession that preceded it served not just theological, but psychological functions, a mechanism for processing the violence and the fear, for maintaining communal bonds, for articulating collective purpose. The chaplains who accompanied each contingent were not peripheral figures. They were essential personnel who maintained the spiritual framework within which the whole enterprise made sense. The relics that travelled with the army, brought by various contingents, carried in portable altars or reliquaries, were treated with an intensity that reflected their theological significance. In a world where God's direct intervention in human affairs was not a metaphor but a conviction, the physical objects associated with holy persons were understood as genuine conduits of divine power. The miracle stories that accumulated around the Crusade, the visions, the appearances of saints in battle, the providential coincidences, were not fabricated for propaganda, though some of them may have been embellished in the retelling. They were the authentic perception of people who expected God to be present in what they were doing, and who found evidence of that presence in the things that happened. The role of the Crusades' chaplains and clergy in maintaining morale during the worst moments of the Antioch siege deserves particular emphasis. In the months of starvation and disease, when the rational response to the army's situation might well have been capitulation or abandonment, it was the clergy who consistently provided the interpretive framework that made continued endurance seem not just possible, but obligatory. The suffering, they argued, was purification. The trial, they argued, was preparation. The apparent abandonment by God was itself a test of faith that would be rewarded. This was not cynical manipulation. The priests who walked among the sick and dying in the camps outside Antioch were also sick, also hungry, also frightened. They believed what they were saying. The distinction between sincere spiritual guidance and motivated manipulation is harder to draw in the Crusade context than a purely secular reading of events might suggest. Adhemar of Lepuy exemplified this clerical role at its most effective. He appears in the Chronicles as a man of genuine personal courage, who sometimes carried weapons into battle, while his ecclesiastical status theoretically prohibited him from shedding blood, a contradiction that medieval canon law navigated with varying degrees of tortured reasoning. He mediated disputes between the feuding lords with a patience that suggests someone who understood the political as well as spiritual dimensions of leadership. His death in August 1098 left a vacuum that was genuinely felt. The military technology and tactics of the First Crusade represent a fascinating chapter in medieval military history. The Western European armies that departed in 1096 to 1097 brought with them a military tradition that was primarily organised around the heavy cavalry charge, the armoured knight on horseback wielding lance and sword, relying on the shock effect of a massed charge to break enemy formations. This had proven devastatingly effective in European warfare, where opponents were generally equipped in similar ways, and the dynamics of combat were well understood by both sides. What the Crusaders encountered in the east was fundamentally different. The Seljuk armies relied primarily on horse archers, light cavalry who could cover ground rapidly, shoot with remarkable accuracy from the saddle, and evade the heavy cavalry charge that was the Crusaders' primary weapon. The feigned retreat was their signature tactic. Advance, fire, fall back, draw the heavy cavalry in pursuit, then wheel and attack from multiple directions when the pursuit had broken formation. This had worked brilliantly at Manzikert against the Byzantines, and it initially worked against the Crusaders as well. At Dorylaeum, only the arrival of the 2nd Division prevented this tactic from achieving a similar result. The adaptation that the Crusaders developed over the course of the campaign was a disciplined commitment to maintaining formation under arrow fire, absorbing casualties rather than charging in response to the provocations that Turkish cavalry used to draw them out. This was psychologically extremely difficult for knights whose entire martial culture valorized aggressive individual action. Holding still while arrows struck around them and killed their horses required a rewriting of instinct that was painful in itself, but it worked. When the Turks found that feigned retreats did not produce the expected pursuit, and when the Crusaders did eventually charge with maintained formation, the Turkish cavalry, which was not equipped for prolonged melee combat, was at a significant disadvantage. The siege engineering that the Crusaders deployed at Nicaea, Antioch and Jerusalem drew on multiple traditions. Western European siege practice was supplemented by Byzantine engineering knowledge. Alexios provided engineers and technical assistance that shaped how the Crusaders approached the problem of fixed fortifications. The mangonels and trebuchets they built were not purely Western designs. The siege towers they constructed at Jerusalem incorporated engineering refinements that had been developed over centuries of Byzantine siege warfare. Crossbows deserve mention as a weapon that was increasingly significant during the Crusade period. The crossbow had a much longer effective range and greater penetrating power against armour than the composite bows used by Turkish cavalry, and in defensive situations, particularly during the Siege of Antioch when the Crusaders were holding their camps against Turkish sorties, the crossbow provided firepower that significantly disadvantaged attackers. The Western European tradition of crossbow use was technically sophisticated, and the Crusaders' ability to supply and maintain their crossbows under field conditions contributed to their defensive capability. The horses, or rather, the catastrophic losses of horses, shaped the entire military situation of the Crusade in ways that the chronicles reflect constantly. A knight without a horse was not a knight in any effective military sense. He could still fight on foot, but he lost the shock capability that made the heavy cavalry arm decisive. The Anatolian plateau's summer heat, combined with inadequate water and forage, killed enormous numbers of horses during the march from Nicaea to Antioch. The army that arrived before Antioch was already significantly reduced in cavalry capability from what it had been at the start. The 8-month siege further depleted the horses, and by the time of the battle against Kaboha on June 28, 1098, many knights who should have been cavalry were fighting on foot. That they won regardless is a testament to their tactical discipline and to the psychological effect of their attack on an enemy whose coalition was already fracturing. The medical realities of the First Crusade are grim and important. The army moved through environments to which Western Europeans had no immunological preparation. New diseases, different parasites, unfamiliar strains of familiar pathogens. The dysentery that struck the camp at Antioch was probably the most significant cause of non-combat casualties over the course of the siege, and it continued to afflict the army throughout the campaign. What medieval people understood as fever, a category that covered many different conditions including typhoid, malaria and pneumonia, also caused significant mortality. The medicine available to the Crusade sick was rudimentary by any standard, though the Byzantine Empire maintained a somewhat more sophisticated medical tradition than the Western European norm, and some of the Crusaders may have benefited from contact with Eastern medical practitioners. The herbs, compounds, and surgical techniques that medieval military surgeons applied were capable of treating surface wounds with some success, but were largely helpless against internal infections, septicemia from deeper wounds, and the epidemic diseases that swept through concentrated populations under stress. The crusading camp at Antioch, sitting in a valley between mountains and river, in a climate that moved from bitterly cold in winter to intensely hot in summer, was an ideal environment for disease propagation. The sanitation of a medieval military camp was primitive, a large force concentrated in a relatively small area, with limited ability to maintain distance between latrines, cooking areas and water sources, and the diseases that resulted were as militarily significant as any battle. Some historians argue that disease killed more crusaders than combat did, and this seems likely. The consequences of disease for the Crusades' leadership were also significant. Various senior figures became ill during the Siege of Antioch, and their incapacitation at critical moments affected decision-making. Bohemond's illness during part of the siege, Raymond of Saint-Gilles' recurring health problems, and the general attrition of the leadership class all made the enterprise's command structure more difficult to maintain. The death of Adhemar of Le Puy in August 1098, probably from typhoid, may not have been a purely military loss, but the effect on morale and cohesion was militarily significant. The diplomatic dimension of the First Crusade is often overshadowed by the military narrative, but it was pervasive and crucial. The crusading leaders were not simply soldiers, they were also politicians and diplomats navigating a complex web of relationships with Alexios, with each other, with the various local powers they encountered along the route, and with the Pope in Rome. The relationship with Alexios evolved continuously from the initial oaths sworn in Constantinople through the bitter arguments over Antioch that developed after the city's fall. Alexios' decision not to bring his army to the Crusaders' relief during the desperate weeks when Kaboga had them surrounded in Antioch. He had been advancing with a force, but turned back when he received apparently false or exaggerated reports that the Crusaders were already defeated, was used by Bohemond and others to argue that the oath was void. Since Alexios had failed to support the enterprise, they argued, the obligation to return recovered lands to him no longer applied. Whether this reading was legally or morally defensible was a question that Byzantine lawyers and Crusader apologists argued vigorously on opposing sides. The contacts the Crusaders maintained with the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt during the campaign represent one of its most interesting diplomatic subplots. The Fatimids and the Crusaders were both enemies of the Seljuk Turks, and there was a period when something like a working relationship seemed possible. The Fatimid vizier Al-Afdal sent embassies to the Crusaders' camp outside Antioch, apparently exploring the possibility of an arrangement that would satisfy the Crusaders' pilgrimage aims while leaving the Fatimid position in Palestine intact. The Crusaders, aware that the Fatimids had just retaken Jerusalem from the Seljuks, eliminating the enemy they had nominally come to fight, explored these contacts without committing to any arrangement. When the time came, they attacked the Fatimid-held Jerusalem just as they had attacked the Seljuk-held Antioch. The local Armenian and Syrian Christian rulers who aided the crusade along its route deserve recognition as active agents rather than simply passive beneficiaries. The intelligence they provided about local conditions, the food they supplied or sold, the guides they contributed, and in some cases the military assistance they offered were not given freely without expectation of return. These rulers were making calculated decisions about which alliance offered the best prospect for their community's survival, and the Crusaders were one option among several. The fact that many of them chose to support the crusade reflects a judgment about where the military momentum of the period lay, not simply a natural solidarity of Christians. The local Armenian ruler who helped the Crusaders find wood for their siege towers at Jerusalem was doing so as part of a commercial transaction as much as a religious one. The merchants of Genoa, who brought supplies and materials by sea to Jaffa, were doing so because the crusade offered commercial opportunities. The practical human motivations that ran alongside and sometimes through the religious ones are not a cynical reinterpretation of the crusade, they are a recognition of how complicated human motivation always is, especially in situations of extreme pressure. The geographic imagination of the crusade is a dimension that requires consideration. The Crusaders were travelling through a landscape that most of them had encountered only in texts, in biblical accounts of the Exodus and the conquest of Canaan, in the descriptions of holy sites in pilgrim literature, in the sermon rhetoric of preachers who had painted Palestine in colours of spiritual intensity. The gap between the landscape they expected and the landscape they found was sometimes disorienting. The Holy Land was not the lush garden of scriptural imagination. Palestine in the 11th century was a region of stark contrasts. The fertile coastal plain, the rugged Judean hills, the barren desert of the Negev, the Jordan Valley, with its tropical vegetation incongruous in its setting. The terrain that the Crusaders marched through in the final approach to Jerusalem in June 1099 was dry limestone hills under a summer sun that baked the earth hard and reflected heat upward into the faces of men already exhausted by 3 years of travel and combat. The approach to Jerusalem involved a significant descent from the highlands of Judea, and the moment when the city first came into sight, from the crest of a ridge where the towers and domes of Jerusalem became visible across a fold of the limestone hills, was one that crusaders who survived it remembered for the rest of their lives. The emotional intensity of that moment, coming after everything they had endured, was described by multiple chroniclers with an effort that suggests they found ordinary language inadequate. The landscape of the siege itself was shaped by the topography in ways that affected tactics. Jerusalem sits on a ridge between two valleys, the Kidron to the east and the Hinnom to the south, and the approaches from the north and west, which the Crusaders used for their main assault, were somewhat less steep than the other sides but still involved fighting on uneven ground that complicated